every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The city of Moscow, Idaho, rests in a rolling, agrarian landscape known as the Palouse, a place where the rhythm of life is often dictated by the seasons and the semester schedule of the University of Idaho. It's a college town in the truest sense of the word, a community that feels insulated, safe, and nurturing. In the autumn of 2022, the campus was vibrant, the air was crisp, and the future seemed as wide and open as the Idaho sky. On King Road, just a short walk from campus, stood a 3-story rental house that was, in many ways, the epicenter of a vibrant student life. It was a place of friendships, late-night study sessions, and weekend parties. It was a home. For the young women who lived there, Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogan, best friends since the 6th grade, it was their final semester together before graduation. For Xana Kernodle, it was a place she shared with her friends and her boyfriend Ethan Chapin, who was a constant welcome guest. They were all on the cusp of everything. Kaylee was preparing for a new job in Texas. Madison was readying for a marketing career. Xana and Ethan, a young couple deeply in love, were navigating the joys and challenges of college life together. They were 20 and 21 years old, living lives filled with the boundless energy and promise of youth. In the pre-dawn hours of Sunday, November 13, 2022, the life within that house was extinguished. A silence fell over 1122 King Road, a brutal and profound quiet that would not be broken until late the next morning. When the truth was finally discovered, the idyllic image of Moscow was shattered, replaced by a crime scene of unimaginable horror. The slayings of 4 bright, beloved students in their own home, in their own beds, sent a shockwave of terror through the community and captured the attention of a horrified nation. With no apparent motive, no signs of forced entry, and no suspect, investigators were faced with a chilling void. Today, on Anatomy of Crime, we dissect the anatomy of a 21st-century investigation. This is not a story defined by a confession or a single eyewitness. It is the story of a case built from the digital dust and genetic echoes we all leave in our wake. It is a methodical reconstruction of a crime pieced together from surveillance camera shadows, faint cellular pings, and the almost invisible whisper of familial DNA left behind on a small leather sheath. We will explore how modern forensics traced a phantom car through the darkened streets of a terrified town and followed a digital ghost, ultimately leading to the arrest of a man who was, by trade, a student of the very darkness he is now accused of enacting. The story of what happened on King Road begins, as so many tragedies do, with a perfectly ordinary day. Saturday, November 12th, was a typical autumn weekend for the residents of the house and their friends. The University of Idaho Vandals had a home football game, a focal point of campus social life. The energy in the town was festive and light. Ethan Chapin and Xana Kernodle, both 20 years old, spent part of their evening at a party at the Sigma Chi fraternity house, where Ethan was a member. They were a well-known campus couple, their affection for each other evident to all who knew them. They left the party and were back at the King Road house by approximately 1:45 in the morning. Meanwhile, 21-year-old best friends Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogan were enjoying a night out in downtown Moscow. They were fixtures at the Corner Club, a popular student bar. Security footage shows them smiling and chatting, enjoying the final weeks of their college experience. After leaving the bar, they stopped at a local late-night food truck, the Grub Truck, a beloved institution for hungry students. Video from the truck's live stream captured them at around 1:40 a.m., ordering food. Laughing with friends, They were happy, unaware, and simply living their lives. A private party provided them a ride home, and they arrived back at King Road at approximately 1:56 a.m., just a few minutes after Xana and Ethan. The house on King Road was home to 6 people in total. Kaylee, Madison, and Xana were 3 of the tenants. 2 other female roommates also lived there, one on the first floor and one on the second floor with Xana. Madison and Kaylee had bedrooms on the 3rd floor. That night, both of the other roommates were in the house in their own bedrooms. The initial hours of the morning passed quietly. Phone records would later show that between 2:26 a.m. and 2:52 a.m., Kaylee Goncalves made a series of phone calls to a former long-term boyfriend. The calls went unanswered. Madison Mogan also made a few calls to the same individual. There was nothing to suggest any distress. It appeared to be the kind of late-night communication common among young people. At around 4 a.m., a DoorDash delivery arrived at the house for Xana Kernodle. This mundane transaction, confirmed by the driver and electronic records, places her alive and awake in the hours just before the attack. A short time later, one of the surviving roommates, identified in court documents as DM, was awoken by what she thought was the sound of Kaylee Goncalves playing with her dog in one of the upstairs bedrooms. The time was somewhere after 4 a.m. A little later, DM told police she heard a voice she thought was Kaylee's say something to the effect of, "There's someone here." It wasn't an alarmed statement, just a simple observation. The sounds that followed were more disturbing. DM opened her bedroom door and peered out into the hallway. She told investigators she heard what sounded like crying coming from Xana's room. Then she heard a male voice say something like, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." This was the moment the night turned from ordinary to terrifying. DM opened her door a second time, and that is when she saw him. A figure clad in black clothing and a mask that covered his mouth and nose walked past her. She described him as a male, about 5 feet 10 inches or taller, athletically built but not muscular, with bushy eyebrows. She stood frozen in what she would later describe to police as a state of shock. The figure walked past her door, towards the back sliding glass door of the house, and exited. DM locked herself in her room. She did not call the police. The reasons for this are complex and debated. Shock, fear, perhaps even a delayed comprehension of what she had witnessed. She may have assumed the figure was a guest of one of her roommates, or that the sounds she heard were not as sinister as they seemed in the dead of night. The sun rose on Sunday, November 13th, over a house that was now a tomb. The 2 surviving roommates woke up later that morning, believing their housemates were still asleep after a late night out. It wasn't until around noon that the first inkling that something was terribly wrong began to surface. Friends had been trying to contact the victims, sending texts and making calls that went unanswered. When a friend arrived at the house and was unable to get a response, the surviving roommates opened the door. One of them went upstairs to check on their friends. The details of the discovery are harrowing. A 911 call was finally placed at 11:58 a.m., nearly 8 hours after the killer had left the home. The call was made from one of the surviving roommates' phones, but the caller was summoning friends to the house, and it was one of these friends who spoke to the dispatcher, reporting an unconscious person. When officers from the Moscow Police Department arrived, they were confronted with a scene of almost indescribable violence. 4 young people had been stabbed to death in their beds. Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogan were found in Madison's 3rd-floor bedroom. Xana Kernodle and Ethan Chapin were found in Xana's 2nd-floor bedroom. The coroner would later determine that all 4 victims were likely ambushed in their sleep and had died from multiple stab wounds. Some showed defensive wounds, indicating a desperate struggle for their lives. The weapon, believed to be a large, fixed-blade knife, was missing. There were no signs of sexual assault. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. It was a crime of pure, unadulterated violence, and it left the small, 25-person Moscow Police Department facing the most complex and high-profile homicide investigation in its history. In the immediate aftermath of the murders, a profound sense of fear and uncertainty descended upon the town of Moscow. The University of Idaho, a place of learning and community, became a landscape of anxiety. Students, who had felt perfectly safe just days before, were now looking over their shoulders. Parents drove from hundreds of miles away to take their children home, unwilling to leave them in a town where a killer was on the loose. The university transitioned to remote learning for the remainder of the semester as the campus emptied out. The vibrant energy of the college town was replaced by an eerie quiet, punctuated by the flashing lights of police cars and the constant presence of news vans from across the country. The investigation was immediately a multi-agency effort. The Idaho State Police and the FBI were called in to assist the overwhelmed Moscow Police Department. They faced an immense challenge. There was no suspect, no weapon, and no clear motive. The crime scene itself, while horrific, offered few immediate answers. Investigators began the painstaking work of processing the house on King Road, collecting every possible piece of evidence. At the same time, they started working backward, trying to reconstruct the final 24 hours of the victims' lives, interviewing hundreds of friends, acquaintances, and potential witnesses. The public, desperate for information and reassurance, was met with a frustrating silence. In the initial days and weeks, law enforcement officials were tight-lipped. They held press conferences where they offered little new information, citing the need to protect the integrity of the active investigation. They initially told the public that they believed it was a targeted attack, and that there was no broader threat to the community. This statement, intended to quell panic, backfired. How could they know it was targeted if they didn't have a suspect or a motive? The mixed messaging sowed confusion and frustration. The community felt they were being left in the dark while a brutal killer remained free. This information vacuum created a fertile ground for speculation. The Internet, particularly social media platforms like TikTok, Reddit, and Facebook, exploded with amateur sleuths. Every detail of the case was dissected, every acquaintance of the victims was scrutinized, and countless theories, ranging from plausible to wildly conspiratorial, were circulated. People analyzed the grub truck video frame by frame, debated the significance of the unanswered phone calls, and accused various individuals, often with no evidence whatsoever. This online frenzy created a parallel investigation, one that was unburdened by facts or due process. It led to innocent people being harassed and vilified, adding another layer of trauma for a community already reeling from the tragedy. It also put immense pressure on the official investigation, as police had to spend precious time and resources chasing down baseless rumors. While the public saw only silence behind the scenes, investigators were methodically pursuing the few leads they had. They knew the timeline of the attack was a narrow window, roughly between 4 o'clock and 4:25 a.m. They also had the surviving roommate's description of the intruder, a tall, athletic male in black. But this was far too generic to be of much use. The real breakthrough would come not from a human witness, but from a digital one. Investigators began the monumental task of canvassing the area for surveillance footage. They requested video from every business, every traffic camera, and every home doorbell camera within a several-mile radius of the King Road house. They were looking for anything unusual in the early morning hours of November 13th. It was an analyst's nightmare. Thousands of hours of footage had to be collected, cataloged, and meticulously reviewed. but the effort paid off. On November 25, nearly 2 weeks after the murders, police made their first public appeal for a specific lead. They announced they were looking for the occupants of a white 2011 to 2013 Hyundai Elantra that had been seen in the immediate area of the King Road residence in the early morning hours of the murders. This was a pivotal moment. The investigation, which had seemed stagnant, now had a tangible focus: a single car in a sea of data. The search for the white Elantra became the central pillar of the investigation. While the public only knew that police were interested in the vehicle, investigators were already piecing together its movements with remarkable precision. They had found footage showing the car making multiple passes by the King Road house, beginning at around 3:29 a.m. On its fourth pass, at approximately 4:04 a.m., it was seen driving up the street. The car then disappeared from view of the cameras closest to the house. At 4:20 a.m., the same white Hyundai Elantra was captured on camera again, this time leaving the area at a high rate of speed. Investigators became cartographers of a ghost's journey. They followed the car's path, camera by camera, as it left Moscow and headed west, towards the neighboring town of Pullman, Washington, just 10 miles away over the state line. They traced its route through residential streets, past commercial districts, and eventually back to the vicinity of the Washington State University campus. By cross-referencing this video evidence with a database of registered vehicles in the area, they narrowed their focus. On November 29th, a WSU police officer, searching for white Elantras registered on campus, found one. It was a 2015 model, slightly newer than the range specified in the public bulletin, but close enough to warrant attention. The car was registered to a 28-year-old graduate student named Brian Christopher Koberger. With a name and a potential suspect, the investigation entered a new covert phase. Investigators delved into Brian Koberger's life, and what they found was both mundane and deeply unsettling. He was a first-year PhD student in the Criminal Justice and Criminology department at Washington State University. He had moved to Pullman from Pennsylvania just a few months earlier, in June 2022, to begin the program. On the surface, he was an academic, a student dedicated to understanding the very mechanics of crime. He had earned a master's degree in criminal justice from DeSales University in Pennsylvania, and his graduate studies had focused on the motivations and decision-making processes of offenders. Digging deeper, investigators uncovered details that seemed chilling in hindsight. While at DeSales University, Koberger had studied under the famed forensic psychologist Dr. Catherine Ramsland, an expert on serial killers who had co-authored a book with the BTK killer, Dennis Rader. The curriculum vitae Koberger submitted as part of his application to WSU revealed a profound, almost obsessive interest in the criminal mind. He wrote of his desire to understand how emotions and psychological traits influence decision-making when committing a crime. Perhaps most disturbingly, investigators found evidence that Koberger may have posted a survey on Reddit a few months before the murders. The post, from an account later linked to him, sought participation from ex-convicts for a research project. The survey asked a series of detailed questions about the commission of their crimes, focusing on the logistical and emotional experience of the offender. It asked questions like, "How did you plan to commit the crime?" and "What was the first move you made to accomplish your goal?" And, most chillingly, after committing the crime, what were you thinking and feeling? It was a glimpse into a mind fascinated by the anatomy of criminal acts, a fascination that authorities now suspected had turned from academic to operational. His personal history was also complex. Friends and acquaintances from his life in Pennsylvania described him as intelligent, but often awkward and sometimes aggressive. He had struggled with his weight in high school and had reportedly been bullied, only to transform himself through boxing and a strict vegan diet. He also had a history of heroin addiction in his late teens and early 20s, a battle he had seemingly overcome before dedicating himself to his academic pursuits. He worked for a time as a security guard for the local school district. He was, by many accounts, a person who struggled to connect with others, a man who often seemed to be observing the world from a detached, analytical distance. Now, investigators suspected that in the fall of 2022, his observations of the house on King Road had become something far more sinister. Having identified a person of interest, investigators needed more than just a car that matched the description. They needed to place Bryan Kohberger himself in the vicinity of the crime. For this, they turned to the second great pillar of modern forensics, cellular data. Law enforcement obtained a warrant for all historical cell phone records associated with a number they had linked to Kohberger. The data they received painted a damning, though circumstantial, picture. The records showed that in the months leading up to the murders, Kohberger's phone had been in the vicinity of the King Road residence on at least 12 separate occasions. These weren't just casual passes through the area. Almost all of these instances occurred late at night or in the very early hours of the morning. It suggested a pattern of surveillance, a possible stalking of the occupants of that house. It was the digital equivalent of a predator casing its prey. The data from the night of the murders was even more specific. At approximately 2:47 a.m. on November 13th, Kohberger's phone disconnected from the cellular network just south of his apartment in Pullman, Washington. This is a common tactic used by individuals attempting to avoid tracking. By turning the phone off or putting it in airplane mode, it ceases to ping off nearby cell towers. The phone remained dark for the next 2 hours, a period that perfectly encompasses the time of the attacks in Moscow. At 4:48 a.m., the phone suddenly reconnected to the network, pinging off a tower south of Moscow on a highway heading away from the city. The data then showed the phone taking a circuitous, indirect route back toward Pullman. Instead of taking the direct highway, the phone traveled south into Idaho before looping west and then north, back toward the Washington State University campus. This strange path suggested a possible attempt to avoid major roads and potential surveillance, or perhaps to dispose of evidence. The phone arrived back in the vicinity of Kohberger's Pullman apartment at approximately 5:30 a.m. The digital breadcrumb trail was forming a clear and terrifying narrative, a journey from Pullman to Moscow under the cover of electronic darkness, followed by a hasty and unusual retreat. While the video and cell phone evidence created a strong circumstantial case, investigators still lacked a direct, physical link between Bryan Kohberger and the crime scene. They found that link in the most intimate of places, on the bed with the victims. During the meticulous processing of the scene, crime scene investigators had discovered a tan leather knife sheath lying on the bed next to the bodies of Madison Mogen and Kaylee Goncalves. The sheath had a distinctive Kabar brand logo, and the United States Marine Corps eagle, globe, and anchor insignia stamped on it. On the button snap of this sheath, the Idaho State Police Crime Lab isolated a single source of male DNA. It was a microscopic trace, but in the world of modern forensics, it was a bombshell. The DNA profile was first run through CODIS, the national database of known offenders, but it returned no matches. This meant the contributor was not in the system. The next step was a groundbreaking and increasingly crucial tool in cold case and active investigations: investigative genetic genealogy, or IgG. Unlike CODIS, which requires an exact match, IG uses public genealogy websites like GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA, where individuals voluntarily upload their DNA profiles to find relatives and build family trees. Investigators can upload the unknown crime scene profile to see if it partially matches any users in the database, which would indicate a familial relationship, a second cousin, a great-aunt, a distant ancestor. Using the DNA from the sheath, forensic genealogists began building a family tree. They found distant relatives of the unknown suspect, and, by painstakingly tracing the branches of the family tree forward through public records like birth certificates, marriage licenses, and obituaries, they were able to narrow the possibilities down. The genealogical work ultimately pointed directly to one family, the Kohbergers of eastern Pennsylvania. Brian Kohberger was now not just a person of interest based on his car and cell phone data. He was the prime suspect, genetically linked to an item left behind at the heart of the crime scene. With this crucial link established, the final pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place with astonishing speed. Investigators now needed one more piece of DNA evidence to make a definitive match: a direct sample from Brian Kohberger himself, or a sample from a close relative to confirm the paternal lineage. They learned that in mid-December, Kohberger and his father had made a cross-country road trip, driving the white Hyundai Elantra from Pullman, Washington, back to the family home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, for the holidays. The FBI began tracking their movements. During the drive, the Elantra was pulled over twice in Indiana on the same day by two different law enforcement agencies for traffic infractions, specifically for following too closely. Body camera footage of these stops was later released, showing a calm and compliant Brian Kohberger behind the wheel, with his father in the passenger seat. At the time, the officers who made the stops were unaware of the driver's connection to the Idaho murders. They had been instructed by the FBI to find a pretext to pull over the vehicle, to verify Kohberger's identity and get a look at his hands. Once the Kohbergers arrived at their home in Pennsylvania, a full-scale surveillance operation commenced. FBI agents and Pennsylvania State Police covertly watched the house, monitoring the family's activities. On the night of December 27th, law enforcement obtained the crucial piece of evidence they needed. Under the cover of darkness, they collected the trash from the Kohberger family's residence. The trash was sent to the Idaho State Police Lab for analysis. From the contents, they were able to isolate a DNA profile from a male contributor. On December 28th, the lab reported its findings. The DNA from the trash was a near-perfect paternal match to the DNA found on the knife sheath at the crime scene. The probability that the two samples came from a father and son was overwhelming. This was the final confirmation. They had their man. Armed with the video evidence, the cell phone location data, and the definitive DNA link, investigators secured an arrest warrant for Brian Kohberger on 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary. In the pre-dawn hours of December 30th, 2022, 47 days after the murders, the quiet of the Pocono Mountains was shattered. A Pennsylvania State Police SWAT team executed the arrest warrant, smashing through the doors and windows of the Kohberger family home. Kohberger was taken into custody without incident. News of the arrest broke across the country, providing the first sense of relief to the terrified community in Idaho and a stunned nation that had been following the case for weeks. Brian Kohberger was extradited back to Idaho to face the charges against him. On January 5, 2023, the probable cause affidavit, the sworn statement by law enforcement outlining the evidence that justified his arrest, was unsealed. For the first time, the public was able to see the intricate web of evidence that investigators had painstakingly woven together. The document laid out the story of the white Elantra, the pings from the cell phone, the eyewitness account of the surviving roommate, and, most importantly, the DNA on the knife sheath. It was a masterclass in modern, multifaceted detective work. The legal proceedings that followed have been slow and deliberate, as is typical in a capital case. In May of 2023, a grand jury was convened and formally indicted Kohberger on all charges. At his arraignment, when asked to enter a plea, Kohberger's attorney announced that he was standing silent, a legal maneuver in which the defendant refuses to plead guilty or not guilty. In response, the judge entered a plea of not guilty on his behalf. The prosecution, in turn, announced its intention to seek the death penalty, citing the aggravated nature of the crime, that it was exceptionally heinous, atrocious, or cruel, and that the defendant exhibited a propensity to commit murder which will likely constitute a continuing threat to society. Since then, the case has been embroiled in pretrial motions and legal battles. Kohberger's defense team has challenged nearly every piece of the prosecution's evidence. They have filed motions to dismiss the indictment, arguing procedural errors with the grand jury. They have challenged the validity of the cell phone location data, arguing it is not precise enough to place Kohberger at the scene. Most significantly, they have attacked the novel use of investigative genetic genealogy, claiming it is an unconstitutional search and that the methods used to build the family tree are unreliable. The defense has also put forward an alibi, stating that Kohberger was out driving alone on the night of the murders, as was his custom, but they have yet to provide any evidence to corroborate this claim. The case is currently progressing toward a trial, though a firm date has yet to be set due to the complexity of the evidence and the high stakes involved. A gag order has been in place for most of the proceedings, severely limiting what attorneys, law enforcement, and family members can say publicly about the case. This has returned a measure of quiet to the public discourse, but it has done little to diminish the intense interest in the ultimate outcome. Brian Kohberger remains in custody, presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. The evidence presented in the probable cause affidavit is, for now, a series of allegations that the prosecution must prove beyond a reasonable doubt to a jury of his peers. The story of the Idaho college murders is, in the end, a tragedy of immense proportions, a story of 4 promising lives cut brutally short. But the investigation into their deaths has become a landmark case study in the power and reach of modern forensics. It showcases a new paradigm of police work, where the digital breadcrumbs we leave are as crucial as the physical evidence we shed. For weeks, the killer was a ghost, a nameless, faceless figure who slipped into a home and vanished into the night. There was no confession, no obvious motive, no disgruntled acquaintance to point the finger at. There was only a void. The anatomy of this particular case is the anatomy of the invisible trail. It is an investigation that unfolded in server rooms and genetics labs, as much as it did on the streets of Moscow. It demonstrates that in our interconnected world, anonymity is an illusion. The silent observers, the doorbell camera on a neighbor's porch, the cell tower on a lonely highway, the commercial genealogy database used by millions to find their ancestors, all became witnesses. They provided the whispers and echoes that, when pieced together, created a detailed portrait of a suspect. This case required investigators to follow a thread of data so faint It was nearly non-existent. To connect dots scattered across the digital and genetic landscapes, it was the fusion of old-school shoe-leather detective work with the most advanced scientific techniques available. A student of criminology, a man who dedicated his academic life to studying the methods and minds of killers, is now accused of becoming the subject of his own research. The evidence suggests he planned his movements and attempted to cover his tracks by silencing his phone, but he allegedly overlooked one small detail: a single touch, a momentary contact, on the button of a leather sheath. In his alleged quest to commit the perfect crime, the student of criminology may have forgotten the first lesson of the modern age. The past is never truly erased. It is simply waiting in the code and in our very blood for someone to find it. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.